Welcome back, focused learners, to another premium military history explainer. Today, we're stepping right into the war room. I want you to picture a giant, hand-drawn campaign map unrolled on a large table, covered in these sweeping pen strokes and constantly shifting lines. Because today, we're breaking down an absolute masterclass in how geography, ambiguous map-making, and profound miscalculations shaped a massive conflict. We are looking at the road to 1962, the Sino-Indian War. This isn't just a story of battles, you know? It's a structural breakdown of how a border dispute, literally atop the roof of the world, transformed into an all-out military offensive.
Okay, let's dive into this and look at our strategic order of battle. First, we'll unpack the ambiguous map lines and buffers, then track the shift from diplomacy to tension and break down the forward policy. After that, we'll hit the Dola post-crisis, the full-scale offensive, and finally, wrap up with our strategic lessons.
Section 1. Ambiguous lines and buffers. To really grasp how two giant nations ended up fighting a war at 16,000 feet, we have to rewind to 19th century British mapmaking, or actually the lack thereof. Let's look at this dizzying array of lines. Back in 1847, British commissioners basically just gave up at the Karakoram Pass. They just couldn't figure out Tibet's northwest boundaries. So, in 1865, a surveyor named W.H. Johnson treks across the completely desolate Aksai Chin region and draws the Johnson Line. The problem? Well, China claimed Aksai Chin in the 1890s and absolutely never agreed to this line. Then, in 1899, the British proposed the Macartney-MacDonald Line. China's response? Crickets. They simply never responded. Finally, in 1914, the British and Tibetans drew the McMahon Line at the Simla Convention, but the Chinese delegate only initialed it. He never actually signed off. So we're left with this confusing web of lines on paper and zero firm mutual international agreement.
Now, for decades, the massive, mountainous region of Tibet acted as a natural buffer state. In 1910, the Chinese briefly occupied Lhasa but withdrew when the Qing dynasty fell, and by 1913, Tibet declared independence. But the board completely changed in 1949 when Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China. On October 7, 1950, the Chinese army marched right into Tibet. Indian Prime Minister Nehru issued a very angry protest deploring the invasion, but the reality on the ground had permanently shifted.
The Himalayan buffer had vanished. Poof, gone. India and China were no longer separated by an independent Tibetan plateau. Instead, they now shared a direct, highly ambiguous, and heavily militarized border based on those confusing 19th century maps we just talked about.
Section 2. Diplomacy to rising tension. So, with the buffer gone, India makes a pragmatic shift toward pursuing friendship.
In 1954, things actually looked pretty optimistic. India and China signed the Panchsheel Agreement, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and India officially recognized Tibet as a region of China. Around this same time, India unilaterally decided to delimit its borders on its own maps, cementing cartographic claims based on the old McMahon and Johnson lines. But imagine their surprise just 3 years later. In October 1957, India makes a shocking discovery. China had quietly built a massive road right through the disputed Aksai Chin region. This discovery lit a fuse that completely exploded in 1959. It started in March when the Tibetan uprising failed and the Dalai Lama fled to India. The Chinese leadership was furious. Deng Xiaoping openly stated that China would settle accounts with India. By August, we see the first shots fired. An Indian post at Longzhou was forced out, leaving 2 Indian soldiers dead. Soon after, clashes broke out at Kinzamain. Then, in October, Chinese troops attacked an Indian post at Konkala, killing 9 soldiers and capturing 10. The era of peaceful coexistence? Officially dead.
In April 1960, Chinese Premier Shah Enlai traveled to New Delhi to attempt a negotiation. He essentially offered a compromise: swap the disputed eastern sector for the western sector, Aksai Chin. Prime Minister Nehru flatly rejected the proposal with this defining quote: "If I agree to this, I shall no longer be Prime Minister of India. I will not do it." And with that, the political breakdown was complete. Both sides started preparing for something much, much darker.
Section 3. The forward policy miscalculation. Here is where we see an immense strategic disconnect between the two nations.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the fatal miscalculation it shows. India's entire forward policy rested on one incredibly fragile premise, that the Chinese would not physically interfere with new Indian posts, as long as India didn't fire first. It simply never occurred to New Delhi that China might preemptively attack. But over on the other side, China, who was fresh off the disastrous Great Leap Forward, viewed these advancing Indian posts as an outright attempt to realize territorial claims by force. It was a military challenge to a militarily superior neighbor.
The execution on the ground was a complete logistical nightmare. Small, scattered Indian posts were established overlooking Chinese positions. By December 1961, Eastern Command was ordered to push forward to the McMahon Line. Guys, we are talking about trekking for weeks into brutal 16,000-foot alpine terrain. Supply lines were basically non-existent. These remote garrisons were freezing and in real danger of starvation. And despite frantic warnings from China of grave consequences, the civilian leadership in New Delhi just dismissed them and pressed forward.
Section 4. The Dalla Post Crisis. The Point of No Return. We are now entering the critical summer of 1962, where those abstract map lines turn into actual troops staring down rifle barrels.
In June 1962, India established the Dalla Post with just 40 men. 40. The Chinese immediately occupied nearby dominating positions, and by September they crossed into the area, taking the Nabkachu Bridge and the Thagla Ridge. In response, India ordered Operation Leghorn, a direct order to evict the Chinese from the ridge. But here's the catch. This was ordered without even considering the sheer logistical impossibility of supplying troops in that terrain.
Let's talk about the geography of isolation. The military commanders on the ground, like Corps Commander General Amrao Singh, explicitly warned that evicting entrenched Chinese forces here required a complete logistic buildup. They knew the reality, but political pressure completely overruled military reality. Troops were literally ordered to march out and fight without adequate supply lines in extremely difficult, uncharted country.
Section 5. The Full-Scale Offensive. This is the inevitable result of all those previous miscalculations crashing into each other.
On October 10th, the Chinese attacked an Indian patrol. 2 days later, Prime Minister Nehru made this very public statement: "Throw Chinese out of NIFA." This was the trigger point right before the full-scale assault.
What followed was a rapid, cascading operational collapse. On October 20th, China launched an all-out, coordinated attack across both the eastern and western sectors. It was blindingly fast. In just a matter of days, Zangdar, Bumla, and Tawang fell. Indian forces desperately tried to counterattack in mid-November, but the Chinese literally swarmed across the lines. By November 18th, Bomdla fell, and Chinese forces had penetrated astonishingly deep, almost to the outskirts of Tezpur in Assam.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why the collapse happened so fast. Look at the stark tactical imbalance on the ground. Indian troop formations were scattered in these tiny, isolated posts of maybe a dozen to 50 men, while the Chinese operated in concentrated, overwhelming force. In Ladakh, Indians were outnumbered 5-1. And the logistics? Indian soldiers were starving at the end of impossible trekking routes, while the Chinese were well supplied from fully prepared lines of communication.
Then, as abruptly as it began, it was over. At midnight on November 20th, having demonstrated total military dominance and securing their territorial objectives, China halted its advance, not pushing any further towards Tezpur, and simply declared a unilateral ceasefire.
Section 6. Final Strategic Lessons. As we pull back from our campaign map, let's head into the debriefing phase of our military classroom.
Objectively looking at the failures, we see 4 main lessons. First, massive intelligence failures. The assumption that China wouldn't fight back was catastrophic. Second, the preparation gap. Ordering an eviction without a logistic buildup doomed the troops instantly. Third, a total failure of infrastructure. You literally cannot fight a war at 16,000 feet without roads. And finally, severe civil-military friction, where political leadership consistently overrode the very real, stark warnings of the tactical commanders on the ground.
I'll leave you with this to think about. The shooting may have stopped in November 1962, but the lines on that map, they are still contested. How do these exact same unresolved geographic ambiguities, those hastily drawn 19th century map lines we started with, continue to shape Asian geopolitics and modern global tensions today? It's a fascinating question, and one that proves military history is never really just in the past. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, focused learners. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.